an ongoing inquiry into promoting Scotland internationally. We're delighted to be joined by the Cabinet Secretary who is responsible for the Constitution, External Affairs and Culture, which is a rather large portfolio. I'll let him introduce himself and anything by way of a short introductory statement. And if you don't mind, Cabinet Secretary, perhaps introduce your colleague.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here and delighted to be joined by Scott Whiteman, who is Head of the External Affairs Division of the Scottish Government. Scott has a long and distinguished track record as a British diplomat, serving before his time in the Scottish Government with the Foreign Office, including a stint as a UK ambassador. Mr Wishart, I start with some brief words of introduction. Thank you very much to you as convener and to committee members for the opportunity to respond to this inquiry, and I'll try and keep my opening remarks short and to the point. I want to be clear from the outset about my and the Scottish Government's focus and purpose in engaging with this inquiry. Despite what some might think, we're well aware of what is reserved and what is devolved, and perhaps have a better understanding in respect of those boundaries than others. You'll be aware that the Scottish Parliament carried out a similar inquiry last year, which focused on the work of the Scottish Government's international network, and this committee's inquiry has a different focus and is looking at how the UK Government promotes Scottish interests internationally. Clearly that's a reserved matter, but given the impact of that activity on devolved competences and indeed on Scotland's economic, cultural and social well-being, it's a matter in which we all have an interest, and it's on that basis that I was happy to come to the committee to give evidence. Although the UK Government has a clear responsibility to promote Scottish interests around the world, I want to draw your attention to the excellent complementary work of the Scottish Government's own international network in representing and promoting Scotland internationally. This is a network that has served and been supported by a range of administrations for more than 2 decades. It attracts investment and creates domestic opportunities and benefits for the people of Scotland. And I and other Scottish ministers have had the privilege of witnessing the excellent work that they do. They are not, as some UK Government ministers and newspapers would have us believe, somehow flying the flag for independence, although I have to say that the position of the Scottish Government on that issue is not exactly a secret. They advance Scotland's interests in the areas of devolved responsibility, including trade and investment, economic development, the transition to net zero, higher education, culture and promoting Scotland's global reputation. I want to state my appreciation for the positive relations and support from the FCDO at Post and in London. In the vast majority of cases, I've seen firsthand many strong working relationships between Scottish and UK Government officials, which have created excellent opportunities to showcase Scotland to our international partners and thereby promote wider UK interests. For example, I had the privilege of an excellent discussion with the then relatively newly appointed UK ambassador to China just last year, had a breakfast meeting with the UK ambassador to Norway during my visit there in February. So if my remaining remarks are critical, I want to recognise the genuine efforts of many UK representatives overseas to promote Scottish interests. On more than one occasion, the Scottish identity has frequently been diluted as part of a UK offering, with Scotland's distinctive brand not always promoted strongly or systematically. If I may, Mr Wishart, I'd like to give 2 examples, both illustrating a different dimension. The first is at the St Andrew's Day celebrations in Paris last November. St Andrew's Day and Burns Nights are key moments in the calendar to promote trade and investment opportunities in Scotland, as well as our cultural and our educational strengths. In full awareness that the Scottish Government was organising with FCDO colleagues a joint St Andrew's Day event to promote premium food and drink production from Scotland in the residence of the British Ambassador in Paris, to be hosted by a Scottish Government minister, the Scottish Office insisted on hosting their own, much smaller event at the residence on the same day. My officials were forced to move our joint event with the Embassy to accommodate the Secretary of State for Scotland. This risked reputational damage, not only for our joint event, but also collectively for the British Embassy and the many Scottish businesses our event was designed to support. The only body politicising this event was the Scotland Office, whose actions are distinctively political, demonstrating a small-minded determination to score constitutional points rather than advocating for or supporting Scotland and thereby the UK internationally. Secondly, and for purely political reasons, Lord Offord, the junior minister in the Scotland Office, revealed private comments he claimed had been made by the Icelandic Prime Minister about Scotland. Such conduct undermines Scotland's interests and our international reputation. It's undiplomatic and it is impolite. This suggests to me that there is an emerging pattern of active undermining of Scottish interests overseas in the pursuit of a rather transparent and narrow-minded political agenda. So despite the genuine efforts of many FCDO officials around the globe, the evidence your committee has received from such bodies as the NFU Scotland, Scottish Chambers of Commerce and the Scotch Whisky Association indicates that the UK government currently does not do enough to promote Scottish interests and our distinct strengths. It also suggests that it would not take much to put this right, though of course I can think of a much better way in the long term of doing just that. In conclusion, Mr Convener, in trying to constrain the Scottish Government's international activities, this UK Government is actively undermining the interests of Scotland's people, its community and businesses. If it truly wants to promote Scotland internationally, it needs instead to start listening to the views of the Scottish Government. And that'll open the way to more effective collaboration to benefit our businesses, our people, our communities, an aim I hope we might all share. Look forward to discussing this with members in greater detail. Thank you very much.
And thank you for that introductory statement. It doesn't strike me as the state of affairs being a particularly harmonious relationship between the Scottish Government and the FCDO when it comes to promoting Scotland internationally. You've given two examples which I think greatly trouble this committee in terms of how this...
Sorry, troubles you, Chair. No. You won't speak on behalf of the committee.
We'll give you your opportunity, Douglas.
Just so long as that's minuted.
Give you your opportunity in a minute, Douglas. I'm just wondering what could be done to improve the relationship between the UK and Scottish governments, and is there anything that you've observed of a cooperative and consensual working arrangement where Scotland's interests are being promoted in a way that you, as the man responsible for this in Scotland, could see working well?
Well, the first thing to say, I was trying to draw a distinction between an often very positive impression working with the FCDO and unfortunate examples that I've given in relation to the Scotland Office, the two different departments. On the Foreign Office front, I would just observe that their colleagues there are clearly thoughtful, trying to work out how can they deliver on their mandate to promote the United Kingdom in all of its differentiated ways. And my experience is that some ambassadors and some missions are very seized of this. They're trying to work out how to be imaginative, how to host events, how to reflect the fact that there are different governments in the United Kingdom and they have on some issues different perspectives. There are other ambassadors, there are other missions where that is less of a consideration. So if there's a reflection I would make is that there is a lack of consistency from that.
Is this all down to the individual ambassador, whether that be or the High Commissioner, whether it be in the different High Commissioners and embassies?
Well, I think a lot of this revolves around people, because I imagine that what the Foreign Office asks its missions to do is to try and promote the entire United Kingdom and to work with the different administrations across the UK. But I think for some there's almost a sense, that's something that the Scottish Government should do, and where there are Scottish Government offices and they're largely based in British embassies, that can work very well. But there are other examples where, whether it's out of sight and out of mind, or it's a more considered omission, I think there are quite significant examples where it is disadvantageous, or the way in which things operate, they do so in a disadvantageous way. And to just give a very concrete example of that, everybody around the table here understands that education is devolved. So it was a surprise to us when the Foreign Office signed an agreement with Germany about educational cooperation for the United Kingdom, an agreement which involves in its partners German organisations, including the Standing Conference of the Ministers of Education and Cultural Affairs of the Länder of the Federal Republic, and further than that, representatives from the Länder themselves, that in sitting down and discussing clearly a good thing, educational cooperation, which I would have thought we all think is a tremendously good thing, that whilst the German partners are sitting there saying, we have a federal system which involves issues which are decided on at a devolved level, so the Länder, that their interlocutors from the Foreign Office at no point saw fit to integrate in their thinking that it was actually the same in the United Kingdom. that education is decided on by governments in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, that there was no involvement of Scottish Government officials in the Berlin embassy in developing this, and the first sight that the Scottish Government received of this agreement, which has an impact on Scottish education, was the day before it was published. So, I'm very keen to put on record that there are plenty of examples that I can think of where there are people who are thoughtful and considerate and wish to try and have a very direct and fruitful relationship promoting Scottish interests. Unfortunately, there are plenty of examples where, whether by commission or omission, do not.
We will be hearing from the UK Government, and obviously they'll be telling us how they see this particular relationship getting along. But we already heard from Lord Offord recently that his concern was that the SNP administration had been encroaching on reserved matters in its foreign engagement, and he went on to say this would be very closely monitored by UK ministers going forward. Is this a statement that you're familiar with, and does this happen?
Well, it bemuses me somewhat, because I would have thought that anybody who knows anything about the way that Scottish Government ministers operate internationally know that I, for example, whenever I meet ministers in other countries, I'm always accompanied by a representative of the local British embassy. That then leads to reporting to the Foreign Office, which means the Foreign Office knows exactly what's discussed. So I'm not really sure what Lord Offord is. I
think what he was referring to was meetings between Scottish ministers and officials of other embassies, other nations, that independence would be put on the agenda for conversations and discussion.
We've never put independence on any agenda in any meeting that we have held internationally. I've really enjoyed the interaction that I've had with, I know, for example, it's Lord Offord who's talked about discussions that he had in Iceland, which followed me meeting the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister there. And they were hugely productive meetings because, as you and others will be aware, we're working really hard to try and to develop Scotland's renewable and hydrogen offering. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity for cooperation right across Northern Europe. This is known and understood by the Foreign Office, because I've met the Foreign Secretary about this, and he's agreed that he thinks that there's tremendous potential in working together on this. So, this is one of those examples where my direct relations with the Foreign Office are really good on this. I'm just mystified as to why the Scotland Office have got themselves wound up about things.
Just to clarify, there is always a British diplomat who will be present with you when you're having conversations.
In all of my ministerial meetings that I have had with a minister internationally since becoming Cabinet Secretary, I've always been accompanied by a UK embassy official.
Has there any ever objections been raised about the type of conversations that you'd be trying to initiate with any of these officials?
No.
Right, just lastly from me, how well are we doing, and I'm saying we, the Scottish Government and UK Government, in ensuring that Scotland's been promoted internationally, notwithstanding some of the issues and examples that you raised with us? Are we doing well enough in making sure that Scotland is promoted?
Well, I'm always ambitious about trying to make sure that we use every opportunity in every location, but cost is a factor for everybody, whether that's the United Kingdom with its embassy network, whether that's the Scottish Government with a much limited network of government offices, as I've already said, mostly in British embassies. So you will always think that there are more locations that one could promote Scottish interests where you're not currently located. Now, I should say, and it's obvious to you because you've had SDI colleagues give evidence to you, there are a number of different networks that promote Scotland internationally. There's the Scottish Government Office Network, there's the SDI network, we have Global Scots, there are trade envoys in a number of locations. But it's significantly smaller than most sovereign states, so yes, we have opened an office in Copenhagen. That's a very good thing to cover the Nordic region. We're aiming at opening a Scottish Government office in Warsaw, again to promote our interest in Central Europe. But you could ask yourself why there are not Scottish Government offices in other capitals, in other markets, in other growth areas. And I would love to see that potential develop, because one of the great things about being able to see at first hand what people are doing to promote Scotland internationally is they do a great job. And I would be very confident that if a network were larger, because we're smaller than other comparative networks, that would bring advantages as well. There are things that we can do in terms of our own networks to make sure that we're getting maximum value out of them. I think we're very, very fortunate to have more than 1,000 people around the world in the Global Scot Network who are keen to help and be supportive and promote Scotland in different ways. I think we need to reflect on, constantly reflect on how do we do things, is there more that we can do, how can we do that, and then deliver on that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon to you both gentlemen. Just looking at the soft power, so Britain is quite hot on, the United Kingdom is quite hot on soft power, and with Scotland's unique landscape, our universities, the universities up there, whisky, all the stuff that Scotland has got to offer. Do you think the Scottish and UK governments could better utilise Scotland's unique identity and existing soft power assets to better promote Scotland internationally? And if so, how could this be done?
I'm not sure we have enough time to answer that question fully. Well, firstly, on the unique identity point, you're absolutely right. And there is much that can be done in terms of promoting Scotland's identity. I'm hugely, hugely impressed and proud of the Scotland the Brand campaign. I don't know if your other members have had a chance to have a look at the latest promotion that is underway, which I think manages to do two things which are quite important really well. One, which is to not shy away from the things that Scotland is known for and liked, which tends to be associated with traditional images of Scotland, but at the same time reflects a newer, more contemporary sense of what Scotland is all about. And here's where Scotland's offer in this respect is, I can't say unique, but I'm not aware of any other examples of this, where we literally have, across all of our agencies that have a responsibility for trade promotion, tourism promotion, inward investment, and that there is a cross-cutting promotional effort to try and give a unified sense of Scotland as a brand, doing both of those things. So are we trying to promote that, both a traditional and a contemporary sense of where Scotland is? Absolutely. Is that something which we see internationally everywhere where the United Kingdom, UK embassies and so on are present? No, that's not always the case. There's a Great Britain campaign which the UK government deploys, sometimes to the extent that there is absolutely no visibility for the Scotland the Brand campaigns that are promoting Scotland. So it was your point talking about unique identity. Sometimes there are examples where that unique identity is not visible at all. So yes, there's some more that can be done there to make sure that at international events there can be an incorporation, if there's a UK stand and so on, for both. Why not? But on the wider soft power, I think there are huge opportunities there, and the Scottish Government has recently launched a consultation on our international cultural work, because we have amazing cultural organisations that tour and go to different parts of the world, and I think they represent Scotland as well, and there's a question of how can we best coordinate their efforts and our wider promotional efforts when they are in different parts of the world. Is there more that can be done? Absolutely. So if and I've already put on record my appreciation for the new UK ambassador to China coming to discuss what are, from the Scottish Government's point of view, our needs, our interests, our concerns, our expectations, many of which incidentally are shared. And I should say it was good to have a follow-up meeting with the head of China policy for the Foreign Office. So you have a really good example there of a very proactive ambassador, a very proactive part of the FCDO, recognising that there is there's a good reason to be working with the Scottish Government, and so that's an example of really good working practice. If other ambassadors, if other embassies, if other parts of the Foreign Office wanted to come along and say, where can we do more, I'd be happy to say, let's meet, let's talk about that, let's see if there are ways of being able to do that. And similarly, by extension, it's not just about the FCDO. Obviously, the British Council plays quite an important role in this when talking about soft power, looking at both culture and education, but other things, to make sure that we have a good working relationship. And I meet with the British Council regularly. We co-sponsor events such as the Edinburgh Culture Summit together with the UK government. Another example of something working well. So if there's a will, there's a way, I suppose, is my answer to you, that I think there is more that can be done if there's a willingness to do that, and I'm very keen to do that.
Thank you. Mr. Whiteman, just going to ask you a question, because obviously your background has been in the diplomatic service and you've got experience of working in embassies abroad and looking at Britain's soft power. How much do you think Scotland contributes to that? And obviously when we're looking at UK government with Scottish interests here in this, is it something that's mutually beneficial to both the UK and to Scotland?
I would say that Scotland adds quite a lot to the UK's brand. We've the latest brand index run by Anholt has indicated that amongst 50 or 60 odd countries, Scotland now ranks 15th in the recognition of its international recognition of its brand, which for a sub-state actor is, you know, a really impressive performance.
What is it about Scotland? What is it that is it? Universities, what is it?
There are different components. There are, as the Cabinet Secretary was saying, there are the traditional elements of Scotland that are recognised. It's recognised as being a very welcoming place. It's recognised for its distinct culture. Across all of the various categories, Scotland did pretty well. The areas where it was less, where there's scope for further improvement, were around recognition of Scotland's strengths in science and innovation. And I think that again speaks to some of the evidence that you've perhaps heard, that there's maybe too much emphasis placed on those traditional elements of tartan, whisky, golf, whatever it might be, and not sufficient attention given to how you can leverage those to get across the really punchy messages about the nature of contemporary Scotland and its strengths in areas of, particularly, for example, universities.
So just looking at promoting Scottish interests within our embassies, so our international network, whether it's through the British Council or embassies. So when we're looking at, you mentioned, Mr. Robertson, in Paris recently, there was a lack of collaboration perhaps between the UK government or the actors you mentioned there and what you were doing. Should there be more collaboration, and should there be less focus on, let's say, St Andrew's Day? Because we've discussed how important it is to really push Scottish interests, whether it's St Andrew's Day, Burns Night. Is that then focusing too much on those traditional things that Scotland is known for, which is haggis and whisky and cashmere and landscape and everything else? Should there be more of a focus now, or less focus on that, because that's focusing on the tradition, or is that something we still need to do in order to use that as a platform for the other stuff that Scotland wants to become internationally renowned for?
So what I would reflect on that, I don't think it's an either or.
Okay.
If we were, if this was a committee of the Oireachtas in Dublin, one would never be considering downgrading what the Irish government's diplomatic network does around St Patrick's Day, where they literally dispatch every single government minister around the world to use that platform of an annual event to get the greater the good, whichever country they're in, to attend. And I was at the recent St Patrick's Day event in Edinburgh, hugely well attended event, but that would only be part of the consular or diplomatic effort of the Irish Foreign Service. So to your point, it seems to me a de minimis, and it has to be said this was not always a given in the past, that we should in post always be using opportunities to use identifiable days, whether that's St Andrew's Day or Burns Day, but there's so many other things that can be used as well. So I'm loath to take the either or challenge, because I don't think it's that. I mean, it seems to me absolute de minimis that one should be using the things one knows for, that is a good peg to get people along to things. I mean, just a really good example of that was the Burns reception that was held by the Scottish Government Office in Brussels this January, where the attendance list was remarkable. Absolutely remarkable. Where was it held? In the residence of the British ambassador. So it's an example where, if you have good working relations, if you are prepared to use dates, events, initiatives to hang your hat on to promote different things, you can be doing as much of that as you should. But I mean, I think you're right to say you do need to be able to reflect both the traditional and the contemporary. And if you get the mix right, then I think you're in the right place.
Thank you. Just very briefly moving over to Mr. Whiteman. So from your experience working in the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, do you think that there should be more, that the Foreign Office should seek to establish a more consistent and regular calendar of events across British embassies in order to promote Scotland and Scottish produce overseas, its tourism, all the other soft power stuff, and all the other goods and other things that Scotland is known for? Should there be a proper, if there isn't one, should there be a proper strategic oversight about planning across the network on Scottish calendar events?
I mean, I think it's hard to invent hooks artificially. Tartan Week now in North America is an additional opportunity, and certainly our office in the embassy in Washington is putting a lot of effort into organising some very contemporary focused events in New York to coincide with that. I would say more important than that sort of approach that you're suggesting is to enhance the understanding really across the board within missions overseas of the nature and the strengths of contemporary Scotland, so that those can then be woven into other activities, some of which might be Scotland specific, but some of which might be more general.
Thank you. And just on that Anholt index, Scotland's gone up from 17 to 15, and we actually beat Ireland, which is number 18. So I think that's something just to note and be proud of. I think it reflects well upon our branding of Scotland. Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, Mr. Whiteman and Mr. Robertson. Mr. Robertson, clearly international governments will be interested in the government of Scotland. It's currently run by the SNP, who's going through a very interesting leadership battle at the moment. Yesterday, your party president and chief executive said the party was in a tremendous mess. Today, Nicola Sturgeon said the SNP is not in a mess. Who do you agree with?
Okay, right. All right.
Well, sorry, Chair.
To discuss Scotland, promoting Scotland internationally, the internal arrangements of the Scottish National Party are not relevant to that. So could you please ask a question related?
I will rephrase my question. You will have to advise ambassadors and others from international countries the political situation in Scotland. When you are doing that, would you agree with Nicola Sturgeon, who says the current governing party of Scotland is not in a mess, or with your chief executive of the SNP, who said it's in a tremendous mess?
Just good to take that note. You will have to advise foreign governments. So I've not spoken to any foreign governments.
Who do you agree with, though?
I think the Scottish National Party is going through a leadership contest where different people have different things to say, although there's plenty that could be said about that, but I'm not sure what that has to do with the United Kingdom government's promotion.
Order, right? It's got absolutely nothing to do with promoting Scotland internationally. We've had an answer. Now, can we please move on to... We've precious little time with the Cabinet Secretary, but trying to find out what the views about Scotland being promoted internationally. Can we please stick to that?
I prefaced my question twice, and I think it's a relevant question, but the Cabinet Secretary is unwilling to answer, and I think people will reach their own conclusions about your chairing of that part of this session. Mr Robertson, you're commonly referred to in the Scottish media as Air Miles... You're commonly referred to in the Scottish media as Air Miles Angus. Do you think at the moment the amount of international travel that you do and the cost to the Scottish taxpayer is seen as a priority when there are many other issues that the government should be focusing on and putting very valuable taxpayers' money towards?
So I see the promotion of Scotland internationally as a matter that creates jobs, that creates investment, that supports and promotes tourism and culture. And I and my office decline more invitations to attend international events than I actually do. Do I think that the travel that I and other Scottish Government ministers undertake in pursuit of the promotion of all of those advantageous elements that a government is actually supposed to deliver on is a good thing? I think we provide good value for that, and there are a great many more things that I could visit and places that I could go that I've yet been to. But my job description is Cabinet Secretary for External Affairs, and the clue's in the name, so my job is there to promote Scotland internationally, and that's exactly what I'm going to do.
That's what your job description says. My question was actually, what do you think of the perception of your constituents in Edinburgh Central, mine and the Highlands and Islands, about that being the focus and taxpayers' money going in that at the moment, when there are critical issues that your government is seeking to deal with, in the challenge in the NHS, in education, etc.?
I'm sure if they didn't want me to do that, they wouldn't have elected me in an essay. They didn't elect you as... May I finish the question, Convener?
Not if we're going to mislead, because he was not elected in that position.
How this works is you ask a question, we get...
You don't let the questions be asked.
If you're not happy with the answer, you can ask your question again.
I will,
Please.
Thank you. Well, if I can move on, you mentioned Minister Offord's comments about your meeting with the Icelandic Prime Minister. Did you or did you not speak about independence with the
She asked me about independence.
So you spoke about independence?
The Prime Minister of Iceland asked me about independence.
So you spoke about independence?
I answered her questions, yeah.
So therefore, Minister Offord was correct in what he said about the discussions that you had with international counterparts and governments on Scottish independence, because you said you never put independence on the agenda, but that doesn't mean you never speak about independence at these meetings.
I'm very polite and I answer people's questions, Mr Ross, as I'm trying to do to you.
So I'm just checking, when you said to this committee that you never put independence on the agenda, that doesn't mean that you never speak about independence in these meetings?
If people are keen to ask me questions, I'm always happy to answer, Mr Ross.
Well, it would be interesting if you would answer about the current political state of Scotland, but we're not allowed to ask about that. So you can confirm that you did speak about independence with the Icelandic Prime Minister in the October meeting of the Arctic Council. Circle.
I refer to the answer he gave a moment ago.
Yes or no?
I did say yes.
Yes.
I was asked a question and I answered it.
And then in
which, as I've already mentioned, would be subject of a report by the UK ambassador to Iceland that was in the meeting with me.
I was just going to come on to that because I noted down in response to the chair, you said that the ambassador or any other diplomat has never raised concerns about you speaking about independence in these meetings. But would you agree with me that diplomats would never do that? They tend to sit very poker-faced, as Mr Whiteman is doing throughout this session, and would never interject in that way. It may come out in a readout of that meeting following. They would never... Could you imagine a diplomat ever interjecting between two politicians in that way?
I don't think that's how it would work. If there was ever an issue that needed to be raised, I would never presume that a British diplomat would not choose a diplomatic way in making their views known on the subject, but never had.
Can I ask on the British diplomats, do you always refer to them as British diplomats, British ambassadors? Do you ever use colloquialisms when you're referring to them in these meetings?
What colloquialisms would those be?
Would you ever call them anything other than the British diplomat, the representatives of the British or the UK government? Have you ever used any phrase other than that?
What would those be, Mr.
I'm
Ross?
asking you, have you ever used anything other than that?
I'm not aware of what phrase you have in mind, Mr. Ross.
Well, the phrase I'm asking you, do you always 100% refer to them as British ambassadors, British diplomats, or have you ever called them anything else?
I can recall a very good interaction I had with the French Europe Minister, with two colleagues from the British Embassy, where I was lauding and praising their abilities as British diplomats working in the British Embassy, to be able to help support British ministers of the British government, whilst at the same time doing so for ministers of the Scottish government, and work to different ministerial directions. I think it was very clear then, I think I'm pretty clear in every other interaction that I have.
You'd never call them the English diplomats?
No, I don't think so.
Never?
I don't think so.
Just checking for this committee that you wouldn't mislead the committee deliberately. You've never called them the English diplomats?
British diplomats, like British civil servants, are British diplomats or British civil servants.
You've never called them in these meetings the English diplomats?
I don't see why I would say that.
It's yes or no to that question.
I have no recollection of ever saying such a thing, no.
You've never said it?
Right, can we please move on? I know he's answered about three times.
He's not actually. Have you ever used misleading statistics when you've been representing the Scottish Government abroad?
I think what Mr. Ross is referring to are statistics that were used both by the United Kingdom Government and the Scottish Government in relation to renewable energy potential. Which
ever used them when you knew they were wrong?
So I have been extremely careful that when I have become completely aware that statistics are out of date, they've been updated, they're no longer the best statistics to use, that those are statistics that I don't use, and I should use the current statistics on things.
Just on a timeline, your department were told on the 6th of September about a statistic, the 25% potential renewables from Europe. This is about this. No, Chair, I cannot believe you're going to stop a politician. I cannot believe you're going to do this, Chair. This is incredible. If you're going to do what I think you're going to do, I wonder if you are following your duties as an impartial chair of this House.
What I'm trying to do is trying to conduct an inquiry into promoting Scotland
let me ask
internationally.
The question.
That question bears absolutely no relation. Unless you get some point of conclusion about it.
Well, I will.
We're here with the Cabinet Secretary today.
So the conclusion is that on the 4th of October, you spoke to governments across Europe about a statistic you had been told on the 6th of September should not be used. Your department then went back to say the Cabinet Secretary, we have a specific ask to include that figure in a statement. They were told minutes later that we don't have the evidence to back up that statement, therefore we advise against using it, but you used it at subsequent meetings. Why was that?
So, Convener, you'll be aware
Chair,
that this is
Scottish Parliament.
I'm happy to be called anything. Note for that. What I want to do is try to ensure that everybody else gets an opportunity to ask questions about promoting Scotland internationally. If you can answer that question as briefly and concisely as possible, then we could move on to the inquiry.
This matter has already been subject of a parliamentary statement in the Scottish Parliament and a significant number of written questions, and I'm happy to answer MSPs in the Scottish Parliament. I'm here to give evidence today in relation to the promotion of Scotland by the United Kingdom Government.
The question...
That is why I'm here to give evidence, Mr. Convener.
But the question, Mr. Robertson, because I still have the floor at the moment, the question is the statistics you use when you're representing the Scottish Government abroad and Scotland's place internationally. And I think, finally, Chair, then, if you're going to try and bring this to a close, I think it's really important that we know about that timeline. Did you knowingly use a statistic when discussing this with foreign governments that you had been told was wrong, could not be proved, and had been asked not to include? Yes or no?
So, Convener, I refer to my previous answer, which is this has been subject to a parliamentary statement.
He didn't get
and
answers
a large
there,
and has absolutely nothing to do with the United Kingdom's promotion of Scotland internationally.
And we've also had an engaged and prolonged discussion about this with another Scottish Government Minister when he was here. So can we now please move on to promoting Scottish internationally? If you finish, we've got 3 colleagues, we've only got half an hour with the Cabinet Secretary. Can we move on?
Well, I still have time compared to what you got at the start. I think it is really important, though. You said you've given statements to the Scottish Parliament and answered questions about this. You'll also be aware that the press have said almost exclusively that you refuse to answer.
Philippa
Why are you
Whitford.
refusing to answer
Order.
to this committee as
Order.
well?
We've been through this. We've
Chair, I
dealt
think we'll
with
have
it.
to have a
We've had
discussion
it.
about
Yes, we
your
will have to
chairing
have a
of this-
discussion about
this
it.
meeting as well.
Philippa Whitford, thank you.
Sorry, just on a point of order then, before we move to Philippa Whitford, can we ask that it to be noted that for the first time the Chair has prevented members asking witnesses relevant questions to the inquiry and from getting answers? And I think this is something we'll have to write to the witness about to get the answers in writing.
Thank you, and we will indeed. Can we now move on to discussing the rest of the session on promoting Scotland internationally, which I'm sure Philippa Whitford will now do. Philippa.
Thank you very much, Chair. Obviously, you'll be aware we've just heard from SDI, who were talking about their advantage being granular understanding of industrial sectors and specific businesses in Scotland. What benefits and expertise do you think the Scotland hubs, obviously most of them are in FCDO British embassies, what do they add in addition in promoting Scotland overseas? And do you think that they promote a closer working relationship in that country between the FCDO in the British Embassy and a Scotland hub if it's literally in the same building or not far away?
I'll let Scott Whiteman talk about some of the more granular detail. Just my impression of going to different countries to see how this works. Again, another example of why it's important to go to places to actually see how things work in practice, is it's quite different in different countries because of the different markets. So, I mean, a really good example of that at the present time is I'm looking at the new hub in Copenhagen with a very particular interest in culture, for example. Because if we look at what has been possible in the screen and TV sector in Denmark, I think there's lots for us to learn there. In Germany, there is huge potential around hydrogen, around renewables, and it's absolutely mission critical that we get that mixture right of what the SDI and their experts who understand different sectors of the economy as their primary function, but then in addition having a talented team, as we do in the British Embassy, that are making sure that we foster the right relations with both the German federal government and the German lender, and that we also have a British Embassy and a post that realises that this is a major priority for us. Now, sometimes that works really, really well, and sometimes it's not quite there yet. So the UK and Germany, for example, is busily promoting hydrogen in the north, where from their point of view, much to the misunderstanding of the Germans, who think Scotland's in the north, they're not talking about the north of Britain, they're talking about the north of England. So there's still, a way to go in some postings and in certain contexts. But I think having a mixture of DTI experts who understand different economic sectors, working together where we have a Scottish Government office and where we have a British Embassy or High Commission that is forward-leaning in trying to promote all of this, I think is hugely advantageous. Scott, is there anything that you'd like to add in terms of different geographies that might be relevant to understand the point I'm making?
I think the natures of the conversation that SDI colleagues have with businesses are a bit different from those that Scottish Government officials would have. So Scottish Government officials would be addressing questions, giving clarifications, explaining the policy context, the regulatory context, putting them in touch with Scottish Government officials or officials from other public agencies, where particularly investors want to understand more clearly what the framework is so that they can work out both the regulatory risk and the political risk involved. So those sorts of conversations, Scottish Government officials would be better placed to have them than would SDI officials. So that's the distinction. I would draw.
And obviously in Germany, SDI is in Düsseldorf in North Rhine-Westphalia, the big industrial Ruhr area, who of course are incredibly interested in hydrogen production from Scotland. So you're saying not just that it's in addition to FCDO colleagues within British embassies, but that there's a synergism by having SDI and having Scottish Government officials within a hub.
I mean, certainly.
Obviously, there's more SDI around the world than...
No, but in Germany, the relationship between the SDI team and the Scottish Government team working on the hydrogen issue is very, very close. And I mean, it's essential. The Scottish Government team is the one that's carved out the strategic opportunity in developing a really long-term relationship with Germany, both at a government level, but also between the major German heavy industrials and power companies and Scotland. And SDI have been able to have those more detailed business conversations on the back of that. They've had more of a struggle in getting the FCDO colleagues on platform and the UK government departments who will have an essential role to play in realising the opportunity. They've had more of a struggle in getting them to understand and act in a supportive way. But no question about it, the role of our office in Berlin has been fundamental in getting us to where we are.
Certainly, I'm chair of the German All-Party Group, and it's been very striking that the lender that we're visiting last year were all also visiting Scotland, whereas that wouldn't necessarily have been the case in the past. So suddenly, finding, as you were talking about, a modern sector, a modern image of Scotland's potential, has awakened an interest in particular.
So here's a really good example of how things actually work in practice. So. I was invited, as was the then Energy Minister Greg Hans, to speak at the Ludwig Erhard Gipfel Summit in Bavaria. And Greg, who's a friend of mine, we're both German speakers, took to the stage to speak about the UK and energy, and literally only spoke about the UK government's perspective on energy. He had the time, and he had the linguistic ability to explain that there are other priorities in different parts of the UK which are complementary, and so an opportunity was missed there. Having said that, and this was the advantage of being at the event, was then meeting with other lender representatives, and in this case specifically the Bavarians. That then led to a Bavarian delegation coming to Scotland and an MOU being signed between Bavaria and the Scottish Government. So this, to my point, I mean, I don't think that, Greg got up on the morning of the Ludwig Erhard Summit and went, I'm now going to speak for a long time about the UK and energy, and I'm going to deliberately ignore Scotland or our ambitions around hydrogen. But that's what happened. So it's a good example of where if things don't work because people forget or they don't think it's important or whatever the reason was, that we are attending events, that we are speaking to people, that we are building the connections, and that we are driving, in this case, renewables, that part of the sector, international cooperation forward.
If I could turn to the diaspora, which is obviously, the Scottish diaspora is of a similar scale to the Irish diaspora, but they work them harder. I'm a global Irish parliamentarian. They have a minister for the diaspora. And in the Scottish Government's report, they talked about having a designated lead to work with the Scottish diaspora. And I know we have the Global Scot system, but when I was in Houston last month at Houston Spaceport talking about the Scottish space industry, the director of the Rice Space Institute, who's from Glasgow, is a Global Scot, but actually feels quite underused. They often don't really know what they're meant to do, where they're meant to plug in. So how do we actually either learn from Ireland or other countries with strong diasporas so that we make not just people who grew up in Scotland, but were educated, were business, or had cultural links, so that all of them can be promoting Scotland overseas in whatever circles they're in?
So it's a really good question, and the timing is really apposite because we're close to publishing Scottish Connections. So this is how do we best approach the opportunities of diaspora. And yes, that has involved academic study and looking at countries that do this very well, and obviously we're well aware of how Ireland does its diaspora outreach. I would just make the point that the history, the story, and as a living example of this, Dr. Whitford will understand this better than most, is that the diaspora is still different. The Scottish diaspora is different to the Irish diaspora. but I hope that the level of ambition is not. One thing that I would draw attention to is I think there are a number of different diasporas. We can think of those that left a century or two ago, we can think of those that left more recently, and we can think of different countries as being traditional diaspora countries. So we tend to think of the Commonwealth, North American countries in particular. But there are other diasporas as well, which I think are relevant. I just draw attention to the fact that a big play has been put on affinity Scots, people who have come to Scotland, lived in Scotland, visit Scotland, love Scotland, and then go home. And this includes a lot of students. Yep. So how do we think about them? And I think part of the challenge that we've got is how do we get people to self-identify that they feel that they are part of that and that they want to do something. So that would just be a general observation, and I can't say much more than that at this stage, given announcements are pending. On the wider point about the global
Just before you move on, I mean, the alumni, the people
yes.
who study in Scottish universities, obviously a very recognisable group. So does the Scottish Government or any agency try and engage with them to offer something before people go back home? Yep. You know, come to an event, or please have this, would you be interested?
So the first thing is to recognise that Scottish universities have a tremendous alumni system in place, and they work that very well, and you know, to an extent it's very important that they manage their own information about who their graduates are. But we are working in partnership with them. So Scott Whiteman was talking about Tartan Week, which is in its 25th year, and an increasingly important dimension to anybody who's been. And I would encourage, I think I'm right saying this committee is going, which is great because you'll be able to see this in practice. One of the growing dimensions to it relates to alumni and the cooperation that there is with Scottish universities to make sure, and in this case, because Tartan Week celebrates the contributions of Scots to the United States, and that is exactly the group that we're talking about there. So we do, and there's more than we can do.
Yeah, I'm just very conscious of this because we've still got Christine Jardine and Deidre Brocktoby. We've got questions for you concluded.
Yep, that's fine.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Cabinet Secretary and I should say, share a good number of constituents. Yes. The last time we met was in the constituency at Murrayfield. But I did not know until today that we shared an interest in federalism. And I can appreciate what he meant about the German lender and how it might have been useful if we had a federal system in this country, that the UK government would automatically have thought in terms of the devolved administrations. But I was very interested when he was saying about a critical mix between the Foreign Office and Scotland's own representatives in those areas, because that very much reflects what was said by the SCDI in the previous session. And they were very confident in expressing that the collaboration and the togetherness that they can achieve with the FCDO is vital in promoting Scotland's interests. Would you agree with that?
I agree that if we can be more than the sum of our parts, then that's absolutely what we should be aiming for. And as I said in my introductory remarks, I mean, I've been able to see with my own eyes examples of where there has been and continues to be tremendous cross-working. And I would just encourage anybody who's in that sphere to embrace all of that. And you know, things are different in different high commissions, in different in embassies, and in different consulates, who we shouldn't forget as well. And you know, if there's more than we can do to help colleagues in those postings understand what it is that Scotland is trying to do internationally, then that would be a good thing. That would presuppose that we were meeting regularly, and that would presuppose that there would be a willingness to have these conversations. I have to say that I was delighted to meet the Foreign Secretary at the end of last year. I think I'm right in saying I was the first person in my post to do so in more than 20 years.
But your post is a new one, is it not?
External Affairs. I was corrected when I said since devolution, when Jack McConnell told me last week that as a previous External Affairs Secretary that he had met with his opposite numbers in the beginnings of devolution.
Okay. I get it. I appreciate that now. I likened actually the relationship to being almost like a tree, where I've worked promoting TV and production companies abroad in North America. And I likened it to contacting SDI and that being the kind of opening, the gateway to this tree that branches out for the consulates, as you so rightly mentioned, in New York, the embassy in Washington, the embassy in Canada. How important is it to Scotland's future that we use that network as effectively as possible, and how do you think we can improve the way we use it?
Well, until we have our own diplomatic network as an independent state, which is what all normal independent countries in the world do, we should use a system that we're part of. And so long as there's goodwill in making that work, then I think we should try and make the most of it. Is that a substitute for being directly represented? No, it's not. Because as we've been exploring, there are unfortunately too many examples of trying to find workarounds or confronting difficulties with which other countries literally do not have, because the relationship is not mediated in the same way.
How important do you feel to promoting Scotland, the brand? Is the image that we portray to the rest of the world? And how damaging do you think the image that the world is seeing of Scotland at the moment might be to that brand, particularly with the problems within our NHS, our education system? How important is it that we address them for the brand?
I think the brand's excellent, and I don't know if Christine Jardine has been able to see the films that are being shown internationally at the present time. In a previous existence, when I lectured on public diplomacy, I was pleased to be able to use Scotland's international brand imagery as an exemplar, because, as I said before, I'm not aware of any other country being able to pull together across its public agencies an agreed brand identity, values, and so on. And that happens in Scotland, and it's excellent. So I would encourage everybody to use it, including members of the Westminster Parliament.
If I could just ask Mr. Whiteman, that metaphor that I used of the branches are different, how important do you think it is that we continue to work collaboratively and develop that approach in the way that we heard from your colleagues previously, although I appreciate you haven't heard what they said?
I'm not sure I can add very much to what the Cabinet Secretary said there. For as long as the UK's diplomatic service represents all of the UK, then we have an interest definitely in trying to ensure that we have the most productive relationships and conversations in place that enable Scotland to take maximum advantage of what is there.
You've both spoken about the Scottishness, the additional factors that the Scottish network can bring to the FCDO. Could there be closer working? Is there a way that it could be done more closely abroad, overseas missions, to bring those factors in, do you think?
Well, I mean, I would reflect on the fact that different posts work in slightly different ways, depending on their size, depending on what their priorities are. There is nothing to stop a British ambassador, high commissioner, or deputy head of mission involving Scottish government officials. They have UK diplomatic passports, and like all civil servants in Great Britain, they are UK civil servants. So there's nothing from an administrative point of view that would stop the inclusion of Scottish government officials taking part in things. But unfortunately, there are examples of that happening. So the case of the education agreement in Germany is sadly a case in point. And it's one that I discussed with the UK ambassador to Germany myself. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to think, is this not devolved? Oh, right, well, maybe we should have our colleagues in from the Scottish Government as part of this conversation. It would take very little to do that. So where there's a willingness, I think there's a way to make all of this work better.
Would either of you say there's an ideal model for cooperation?
Before addressing that, might I just add something? I think there's a lack of appreciation sometimes that the devolved governments might have something interesting and particular perspectives and interests in areas of reserved responsibility internationally. And that, that's one area where the dialogues and the conversations don't take place as helpfully as they might.
Okay, thank you. And do you think there's an ideal, either of you, an ideal model of cooperation that we could work towards to Scotland?
I think it comes and goes, which is why I'm sort of reticent about pointing to one place. And I also want to protect the space for people internationally to hear, whether it's the Scottish Government network or indeed the FCDO network, that there are great examples out there. And would wish to highlight those, whilst at the same time I think there is room to grow in others, which I've tried to highlight at the same time. I think a lot of this revolves around people. I think a lot of this revolves around people's willingness to understand the nature of the devolved settlement and feel empowered to make the most out of that. I mean, I appreciate that on the constitutional question I represent a very different perspective to my UK government opposite numbers. But we're all in favour of economic success and the promotion of trade and dealing with the climate crisis and so on and so on. So just realising that we all have a legitimate space in which to promote our interests and priorities is not something that one should be fearful of. It should be embraced.
I say that you and I should perhaps do the same where our joint constituents are concerned.
There we go, a note of consensus there. Did you rock?
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon.
Good afternoon
to you both. It's great to see you. Could I just ask about the engagement that you've had with the new UK government's new trade and investment hub in Edinburgh, both yourself, Minister, and also officials?
I don't think I've had any. Now, I should say, I think it's important to differentiate between my job as Cabinet Secretary for External Affairs and my colleagues who deal with in the enterprise and economy space.
Yeah.
And so where the SDI colleagues who are here before giving evidence, they answer to my Cabinet Secretary for Finance and fellow ministers on the trade and investment side rather than me. Have I been in Queen Elizabeth House? I think I'm the first Scottish Government minister to have ever been invited to go. So yes, I've been. And I pass it every day on the way to the Scottish Government office at the top of Jacob's Ladder.
Mr. Whiteman.
So there's a Directorate for International Trade and Investment within the Scottish Government, and colleagues there would be the ones that would be having the principal interaction. I have met the head of the office, but in a sort of unofficial context.
Okay, thank you. And can I just ask, the previous witnesses, the SDI witnesses, suggested that there was sometimes a nervousness amongst diplomats and in the embassies about favouring one of the devolved nations over the other. Is that something you've come across? And if so, how would one overcome that? I don't know how closely you work with counterparts in the other devolved nations.
So I'm unaware of any of that. I have gone to capitals where I have met with representatives of the Welsh and Government and Northern Irish Executive. That would be in Brussels and in DC. There's slightly different models where the Irish representation in Washington DC is not in the embassy, if I'm getting my recollections right. But there is a Welsh colleague working in the British embassy in Brussels. I'm not aware of competition in a detrimental way. I think having a bit of competition is a good thing, frankly, but in a detrimental way. And far from it, I've found myself at events when I've gone, because people think it's important for the Scottish Government Minister to attend these events and help promote them, that I've often been introduced to colleagues from Wales or Northern Ireland who are delighted to attend events, and then it's reciprocated. I'm sure Scott Whiteman can give lots of other examples of that, but my experience of it is that there's a very good working relationship.
I think there's you can find some nervousness amongst UK government officials about devolution issues. This was probably not the case 20 years ago when people were still familiar and there was perhaps more focus on training and ensuring that UK civil servants more generally understood the devolution process. And some of those practices, I think, perhaps have eroded over time. So the confidence with which individual, either heads of mission or their staff, sometimes engage on issues that touch the devolved governments can be variable. And I think what SDI colleagues were saying was sometimes when it's really important that there should be a very rapid response to a business request, if there's a lack of confidence within the mission about how they should be dealing with devolved institutions, that appears sometimes to lead to delay. I'm not conscious of that myself personally, but that, as I understand it, was what SDI officials were saying.
So react quickly. But I mean, this is kind of a constant theme that we've heard over the years, just about civil servants in Westminster being nervous about handling, or just civil servants generally, Whitehall, I suppose, being nervous about handling devolved issues. How do you think one gets round that in the future? I mean, what needs to be done to try and address it? Because it does seem to be something that comes up time and time again over the years.
I think it's certainly useful when we have opportunities to talk to heads of mission before they go out to take up their posts. Those sorts of conversations are useful. I try to use my old personal networks from within the FCDO to make sure that people feel that they can come to me if they've got questions, that they come directly rather than always having to channel them through the devolution unit in FCDO.
Is it time, though, for a more structured approach, term set down sort of thing, raising awareness of?
I think raising awareness of devolution across the board would be a helpful thing.
Agreed. Could I just ask about the 2013 Memorandum of Understanding on International Affairs between the devolved administrations and the UK government? I think, Minister, you've described it as not having facilitated good working relationships. Why is that, and how might it be improved? Can it be updated?
Well, I mean, I've got experience in this in a more general sense in terms of relationship with the rest of the UK government as part of my Scottish government responsibilities. I mean, I think it's very different from one government department to another. So there's the infamous example of the Home Office being asked for 13 times to meet with the Scottish government to discuss issues, refusing on all occasions. In the knowledge that I was coming down here to see your good selves, I asked that I might meet with my new Culture Secretary, opposite number. I think to date we're still waiting on a reply, and I'm heading straight from here to the train station to go back. So, I mean, I think one can point to memoranda. One can point to what people say. We aspire to having good relations. We wish intergovernmental relations to be good. But it kind of depends on people saying, yes, that's... I am going to meet my opposite number. Yes, I am going to have discussions about this issue. Why have I not met my opposite number in office ever? Etc., etc. So... is there more that can be done? Absolutely. But I think one has to have an awareness about how things operate in practice as opposed to how it is described by some people, which is absolutely not reflective of the reality of how things actually operate.
Thank you.
Well, we've got you right out at 5 o'clock, I think.
There you go.
But
that's right, I'll make the train.
Cabinet Secretary, thank you ever so much for your contribution today. I think there was a couple of things that you said you might get back to us with. A note was taken, and we look forward to your responses and replies. But again, if there's anything that you feel you could constructively assist this committee with in the course of this inquiry, please, we'll be happy to receive anything further from you. But for this afternoon, thank you for your attendance. Order, order.